A dog was almost exhausted trying to warn a policeman about something. When the policeman discovered the truth, it was more terrible than he thought. A crowd gathered slowly on the corner of Maple, where Max, a thin, weather-beaten German shepherd, struggled forward, barely keeping its legs beneath it. Those who stopped to look whispered to each other in confusion and pity. The dog was ragged and underfed, fur matted with dirt, bone visible under taut skin. But there was something oddly arresting about it. Held tightly between its worn, cracked jaws was a doll, almost ragged and covered in grime, as if it had been carried for miles and miles. Mrs. Tucker, a retiree who lived in the apartments just across the street, muttered, "Poor thing." She looked at the doll, then back at the animal. "It's protecting it, isn't it?" Her neighbor Ron nodded. "Looks like it." He took a step closer. "Think it'll let go if we get it something to eat?" A young woman, already coming back from a nearby convenience store, approached the dog with a small can of food and a plastic bowl of water. She bent down, gentle and cautious, but the dog only tightened its grip on the doll, pulling it closer as though it expected her to snatch it away. She murmured, half amused, half concerned, "Guess that's a no. Look at those eyes, though. He's determined." The dog turned its head towards the direction of the police station down the road. It was only about a block away, its grey brick facade visible from where the crowd had gathered. The dog seemed to take a few more shaky steps forward, its legs trembling under the strain, but kept its course. People moved aside as it continued its march, slow but steady. The doll's dirty yellow dress flopped with each labored step, and with every shake of its worn, scarred body, the dog still managed to hold it firmly, carefully even. It was a silent determination, one that captured a curious reverence from the bystanders who began trailing behind. Finally, the dog reached the threshold of the police station. It hesitated, swayed, and then, with the last ounce of its strength, it staggered into the doorway and collapsed. Its body lay still, but its jaw clenched around the doll with a steadfast grip, refusing to let go even in exhaustion. Inside, Officer Clark had been filling out paperwork when the commotion caught his attention. He moved quickly to the entrance and saw the dog on the ground, panting heavily, ribs heaving beneath its filthy fur. The doll was still held tight. "Officer Clark." All right, buddy," Clark muttered, bending down and gently reaching under the dog's frail frame. He called to another officer. "Officer Clark, get some water, would you?" He carefully carried the dog to the back of the station, placing it on an old wool blanket someone fetched from the storage closet. The dog lay there, barely moving, but its eyes were open, scanning the room. Clark knelt down and offered a bit of water, which the dog finally took, pausing only to glance at the doll each time it stopped to lick the bowl. But then, as if driven by some unseen impulse, the dog jerked its head up and fixed its gaze on the wall across from them. It began to growl softly, a low guttural sound, and then the growling turned to barking, first a warning bark and then a deep, mournful cry that echoed through the station. Its eyes were focused, unblinking, on a large bulletin board plastered with photographs and notices about missing persons and wanted criminals. The doll slipped from its jaws for the first time, but the dog seemed not to notice. "Officer Riley, what's he barking at?" "Officer Clark." I don't know," Clark said, keeping his voice low. "Officer Clark." But he's staring right at the board. The dog, as if it understood the officer's curiosity, placed its front paw on the ground, pushing itself up with what strength remained, then turned to Clark almost pleadingly before looking back at the board. It raised a paw, clawing at the air as though trying to reach it. "Officer Clark." All right, let me take a look," Clark said, a strange chill prickling the back of his neck. He approached the board slowly, eyes flicking over the photographs pinned there. As he moved closer, the dog began whining softly, a pitiful, desperate sound that seemed to swell with each step he took. Clark scanned the photos carefully, and then his gaze landed on one of them, a picture of a 7-year-old girl with soft brown curls and a bright smile, her name printed below, Alice Harper, a 7-year-old girl missing now for 2 weeks. Clark's stomach tightened. He turned back to the dog, whose eyes were locked on him, the despair in them mirroring something dark and painful. Slowly, Clark reached for the picture of Alice and held it up. The dog's gaze followed, unwavering, and it let out a whine so broken it sent a shiver down his spine. Clark stood still, his mind momentarily blank as he processed what he was seeing. Clark's spine tingled with an unexpected chill, a feeling creeping up on him that there was something very wrong here. The oddity of it all hit him. A stray, haggard dog, barely standing, had dragged itself into the police station, refusing food and water, clutching an old doll like it was a lifeline, and now it was staring at this picture, barely blinking, as though it could sense something that none of them could. The dog's fixated attention on Alice's photograph felt unsettlingly intentional, almost as if it were trying to communicate. Clark couldn't shake the thought that somehow, in a way he couldn't quite understand, this dog knew something they didn't. He approached the wall, his fingers brushing against the photograph of Alice, his eyes flickering between her innocent smile and the doll the dog still held protectively in its jaws. Clark's stomach knotted. It was just a doll, yet as he looked closer, an uneasy realization crept over him. The doll looked strikingly familiar. In the picture, Alice clutched a doll almost identical to the one the dog had dragged in. The dog, noticing Clark's interest, released a low, quiet whine, and then, as if in response to Clark's unspoken question, it stepped forward, lowering the doll to the floor in front of him. Clark's breath caught in his chest. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The battered, dirt-streaked toy had clearly been through a lot, but he could still make out its distinctive blue dress and a small, stitched tear on the left arm. Alice's doll. There was no mistaking it. Clark knelt, his hands hovering over the doll, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Silent, broken only by the soft, exhausted panting of the dog, Clark finally reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the doll. The worn fabric felt strangely heavy in his hands, as if it carried all the weight of the girl's disappearance. He looked back at the dog, who now sat with its gaze fixed intently on him, its dark eyes almost expectant. "Clark," softly to himself, "where did you come from?" But the dog didn't break eye contact, and its steady, piercing gaze seemed to hold some answer he was just on the edge of grasping. Clark clenched his jaw, fighting the rising wave of questions flooding his mind. The timing, the doll, the dog's intense fixation on Alice's photo. It was all too much to be random. No, this animal knew something, he was sure of it. Without warning, the dog's demeanor shifted. It let out a sharp bark, then another, more insistent one, and nudged at Clark's knee with its muzzle, as if urging him into action. Clark felt a tug at his gut, an undeniable pull. Before he could second-guess himself, the dog leaned in, nipping gently at the hem of his pants and tugging, its gaze darting toward the door. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. The dog wanted Clark to follow, and he had a strange, gut-deep certainty that ignoring it wasn't an option. "Clark," softly to himself, "all right, let's see where you're trying to lead me." He cast a glance around the precinct, the faces of his colleagues registering varying degrees of curiosity and concern. They'd all seen the dog's peculiar behavior, and some of them were still watching, eyebrows raised. But Clark was beyond caring about appearances right now. He gave a slight nod to the others, a silent reassurance that he had it under control, and then he turned back to the dog. The dog gave a final insistent bark and nudged the doll one more time before stepping back, its eyes locked onto Clark's with something almost like urgency. Clark picked up the doll, gripping it tightly in one hand as he rose to his feet, his heart thudding in his chest, the kind of low, deep beat that signaled he was on the verge of something he couldn't yet see. He hadn't felt this since the last big case, a kind of electric tension telling him he was standing at the edge of a mystery, one he couldn't walk away from. He took a step, and the dog turned immediately, trotting toward the door with a new energy that belied its previous exhaustion. Clark followed, feeling an odd mix of anticipation and trepidation building within him. He glanced back once more at Alice's photograph, the smile frozen on her face. So young, so trusting. The doll in his hand felt colder now, the reality of what might lie ahead settling heavily on him. They stepped outside, the late afternoon casting long shadows across the pavement. Clark took a deep breath, steadying himself, and quickened his pace to keep up with the dog as it led him down the street. He still didn't know where they were going, or what exactly he'd find when they arrived. But one thing was certain. This journey was one he couldn't turn back from now. Clark kept his eyes on the dog trotting purposefully ahead of him. The streets were quieter now, and the city was settling into its usual nighttime stillness. Streetlights cast long shadows, and every now and then the sharp sounds of distant traffic punctuated the silence. Clark knew the back alleys of this city. He'd patrolled them long enough. But there was something different about being here tonight, following a dog that seemed to have its own plan, its own private map. The dog slipped down a narrow side street, one Clark might have missed if he hadn't been keeping close. It moved with a determination Clark found unsettling. It was as if the dog knew this path too well, maneuvering through twisted lanes and narrow alleyways, as if it had been down this route 100 times before. Clark quickened his pace to keep up, wary of letting the animal get too far ahead. The city closed in around them, turning into a maze of dark, winding passages, the kind where memories tend to linger heavy in the air. After what felt like an endless series of turns, the dog stopped in front of an old building hidden deep within a neglected alley. It was one Clark didn't recall seeing before. The structure was more a husk than a home, a neglected relic from decades past, crumbling bricks, boarded windows, and a thin, eerie veil of ivy wrapped around its frame. Even from a distance, Clark felt the air shift, growing colder, heavier. He halted instinctively, reaching for the flashlight at his side, letting the beam sweep over the building's face. There was a strange stillness here, a kind of forgotten quiet that lay heavy over everything, muting even the faintest of sounds. The dog barked suddenly, breaking Clark's concentration. It looked up at him with intense eyes filled with a kind of urgency that was hard to ignore. Clark felt a pang of apprehension, but steeled himself and stepped forward, his hand brushing against the rough surface of the door. It was slightly ajar, wedged tightly between crates and rusted old furniture, as though someone had gone to lengths to make sure it remained hidden. He set to work, carefully moving a broken chair and shoving aside a few musty cardboard boxes to clear the entrance. The dog waited beside him, silent now, as if sensing that this was where Clark's part began. Taking a deep breath, Clark gripped the door and gave it a pull, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the empty alleyway. He stepped inside, and the faint scent of mold hit him immediately, mixed with the bitter tang of neglect and disuse. Clark paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. His flashlight flickered over scattered debris, stained walls, and layers of dust settled over everything, untouched for who knew how long. He swept the light slowly, taking in the chaotic scene, furniture thrown. The room was abandoned, cloaked in silence, with an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. It was as if time itself had paused, leaving behind only remnants of what once was. Clark stood at the entrance, taking in the scene, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. Haphazardly, a few overturned chairs and tattered drapes hung limply from broken curtain rods. Nothing seemed quite right. The dog brushed past him, drawing Clark's attention to a door at the far end of the room. Clark followed his steps, cautious, his senses on high alert. They reached the door, and this time it was the dog's turn to hesitate, glancing back at him almost as if asking for reassurance. Clark placed a hand on its head, a quick, instinctive motion meant to calm them both. Then he pushed open the door, and together they descended down a narrow staircase, each step creaking underfoot. The basement air was thick, damp, pressing in from all sides. Clark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating walls lined with flaking paint, trails of mold creeping up like ghostly tendrils. At the bottom he paused, letting the light sweep over what lay before him. The room was cramped and low-ceilinged, crammed with old mattresses and faded blankets. Cans of food, half open, littered the ground alongside discarded clothes and plastic bags, a sparse collection of what could barely be called belongings. The unmistakable signs of habitation were scattered everywhere, and Clark's stomach knotted as he realized what he was looking at. This was no shelter. It was a prison, a place meant to hide people, keep them tucked away from sight. But it was the small details that caught his eye, that seemed to shout louder than the rest. Among the debris were passports and documents tossed carelessly onto the ground, their edges creased and smudged. Clark bent down, flipping through them with quick, efficient fingers, a cold horror settling over him as he registered the ages listed on the IDs. All of them were for children, mostly African, no older than 10. their faces staring up at him from the faded photos with expressions of vulnerability he couldn't ignore. Clark. What the hell? He muttered, his voice almost swallowed by the oppressive stillness around him. The dog paced beside him, agitated, letting out low, anxious whines as if urging him to keep moving. Clark swallowed, pushing aside the rising bile. He felt as though he were trespassing in a nightmare, one cobbled together from whispered stories and the worst parts of human nature. His gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where he saw a pile of small, dusty backpacks, some decorated with cartoon characters, a grim reminder of innocence lost. Clark reached for his radio, his hand trembling slightly. He steadied himself, taking a slow breath. This was just the beginning. Clark's heart thudded as he and Max left the old warehouse, the weight of what they'd found pressing hard on him. The abandoned building with its damp walls and dim flickering light had revealed a chilling truth. Pushing down his instinct to recoil, Clark had moved swiftly, snapping photos of the makeshift beds, the small worn-out backpacks, and the scattered children's toys. He knew these items held stories he might never fully understand, stories of fear and longing and separation. He'd secured everything he could, moving quickly but methodically, before Max nudged him with an anxious whine, urging him to hurry. Clark took one last glance at the shadows in the far corners, then led Max out, his jaw set, ready to bring these revelations back to the station. At the station, Clark met the team with a rare, quiet intensity. He didn't need to say much. The gravity on his face was enough. He placed the photos on the evidence board, each one drawing an uncomfortable silence from the team as they studied the dilapidated shelter, the clothes, the abandoned toys. One of the detectives, Evans, let out a low whistle. Evans. It's bigger than we thought, isn't it? Clark nodded. And more organized than we ever imagined. I have a feeling this warehouse is just a piece of a larger puzzle. He saw their faces. Disbelief mingled with dread. This wasn't just a local operation. The conditions and items in that basement hinted at a dark, far-reaching network. Clark turned his focus to Chief Roberts, who had been studying the photos in silence, a deep frown furrowing his brow. Clark. We're dealing with trafficking, Clark said quietly, his voice rough. Investigation and operation. You're telling me this could be international? Nodding grimly. We need more than just our local resources, Chief. We need Interpol on this. Every sign points to a larger ring. We can't risk missing the bigger picture. Sighing, gazing at the evidence. I'll make the call. We'll start by looping in Interpol and any agencies with open trafficking cases. This is bigger than any of us imagined. With the go-ahead from Roberts, the station transformed overnight into a hive of relentless activity. Phones rang as officers coordinated with federal and international contacts, and desks filled with notes, maps, and timelines. Clark didn't allow himself to slow down. He stayed immersed, pushing forward every lead they uncovered. The old frayed map on the wall filled up with pinpoints of potential safe houses, trafficking routes, and connections to other known criminals. This case, he realized, was only beginning to reveal its true extent. As the hours passed, Max, now officially stationed at the precinct, had been making his rounds, quietly observing the team. It was almost as if he knew he was part of this, like he had a vested interest in the outcome. One officer set a small bowl of water near Max's makeshift bed, but Max barely looked away from the action, his eyes following every movement Clark made. Clark, noticing Max's calm alertness, walked over and knelt beside him, scratching the scruffy fur behind his ears. Clark, you found this for us, buddy. This is as much your case as it is ours. He'd never been one for sentiment, but Max wasn't an ordinary dog. Clark sensed that Max had more to tell, that he might hold more secrets about this case than they'd yet uncovered. And Clark had learned long ago that intuition, whether human or animal, was rarely wrong. The late-night hours stretched into dawn. Fatigue crept in, but Clark kept going, driven by thoughts of the families affected. As a father himself, he could only imagine the agony these families were enduring. He thought of his own daughter, safe at home, and a chill swept over him. The idea that children could be stripped of their innocence, caught in the clutches of criminals with no regard for their humanity. This was personal. Clark clenched his jaw, the resolve burning stronger. He would see this through, not just as a detective, but as a man who could never ignore the silent cries of the young and vulnerable. By morning, the precinct was ready to expand the investigation with federal support. Leads had come in from neighboring towns, small but potentially crucial fragments that could connect the dots, and the team prepared to head out on these new trails. Max sat by Clark's side, his tail occasionally thumping the ground. Clark had come to rely on Max's presence, a silent partner who had, against all odds, become one of their most reliable assets. Evans, seems like he was meant to be here, huh? Clark, he's got the instincts. Evans, I've seen a lot of strange things in this job, but I gotta say, this one takes the cake. Clark, strange times call for strange partners. He looked back at Max, who was staring up at him with that familiar, intense gaze, as if urging him forward, as if to say, we're not done yet. A full week had passed since the police began their covert surveillance of the abandoned warehouse. Officers had come and gone in shifts, tracking every shadowy figure entering or leaving, noting each vehicle that idled by the docks, and listening in for anything that might reveal what was going on behind those thick, rust-streaked walls. By the end of the week, Clark and his team were certain this warehouse was a transit point, where children, lost in the system or stolen, were held before being smuggled abroad. The decision was made to proceed with a high-stakes operation. This time, they would have the support of the Special Forces. Clark stood at the edge of the waterfront with Max, the police dog who'd proven instrumental in the case so far. Clark had often marveled at the dog's persistence and intuition, which at times seemed almost supernatural. Max waited beside him, as steady and loyal as always, his sharp eyes following every movement on the pier. Nearby, officers in unmarked cars. It was a quiet night, cool and damp, with a breeze carrying the faint smell of salt and diesel from the docks. Clark checked his watch, feeling the tension knot in his stomach. It was almost time. A crackle sound in his earpiece, targets approaching the warehouse. Clark shifted and motioned to Max, who instantly straightened as if understanding that his role in the mission was about to begin. From their position, they watched a dark SUV roll up to the warehouse, headlights cutting through the mist. This was the vehicle they'd been tracking all week. Information from an informant had led them to believe it would be transporting children in the next few hours. Max tensed, nose twitching as he tracked the scent left in the air by the vehicle. Clark leaned down, giving Max a soft pat on his side. "This is it, buddy. Let's find them." As planned, they waited for confirmation that all personnel were in position. When the order finally came, the team moved as one. Clark and Max followed Sergeant Thomas and a group of officers who approached the side entrance where they noted the SUV had been parked. Max darted forward, nose to the ground, sniffing for clues that could lead them to the captives inside. The dog paused near a spot behind the warehouse, pawing at a corner by the rear wall. Clark signaled to Thomas, who nodded and motioned for the team to spread out. They moved quickly, each officer covering the next, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every inch of the ground ahead. The silence was broken only by the murmur of commands over the radio and the quiet padding of Max's paws against the gravel. Then, chaos. Suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening cacophony of gunfire and shouting. It all happened so fast. The officers stormed the warehouse, weapons ready. Clark held onto Max's leash tightly, guiding him safely through the thickening cloud of tear gas. As they entered through the haze, Clark caught sight of a group of children huddled together in a dark corner, their eyes wide with fear. He felt a surge of relief, but knew they couldn't lower their guard just yet. He steered Max towards the children, hoping his presence would calm them even just a little. "Clark, keep close to Max," he called softly to the children, pointing at the dog who was sitting obediently, watching over them. His words seemed to register with a few of them, who clung to each other as Max nudged forward, staying between them and the danger. In the chaos, the leader of the gang appeared, a tall, cold-eyed man with a grim set to his jaw. He spotted Clark and Max, his expression hardening as he raised a gun toward them. Clark froze, instincts on full alert. In a flash, Max bolted forward, barking loudly, his body a streak of movement that sent the man stumbling backward. Seizing the moment, Clark took cover, motioning for the nearby officers to engage. Within minutes, the situation began to turn in their favor. The rest of the gang members, realizing they were outmatched, were quickly subdued. The sounds of children crying and the murmur of reassurances from officers filled the space as the team worked to evacuate the captives. With the immediate threat neutralized, Clark turned his attention back to the children, who were now being led outside to waiting ambulances. He saw a little girl in the crowd who looked strikingly familiar. Alice. She was clutching an old, worn-out doll, her gaze searching the crowd, dazed but alive. Clark's heart leapt with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Alice was safe. He walked over, crouching down so she could see him. "Clark. Alice," he called gently. She looked up, and recognition flickered in her eyes. "Alice, you came to find me, Clark." "We did. We're taking you home." Max trotted up beside him, sniffing at Alice, who gave him a tentative pat. She looked at him as though she knew Max had been part of her rescue, a quiet hero by her side in the most frightening moment of her life. After what felt like a long night of chaos and danger, Clark finally exhaled, a wave of peace washing over him as he watched the children being taken to safety. The operation had been a success. The children, including Alice, were now out of harm's way. The gang leaders were handcuffed, their faces sullen as they were led out one by one, with no more places to hide. As they loaded the last of the gang members into a police vehicle, Clark felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He gave Max a grateful pat on the head, knowing they had done their job, and knowing the world was a little safer for children like Alice. Alice sat silently in the small, quiet room at the police station, her fingers absently tracing the seams of her well-worn jeans. The officers had been gentle, kind even, but she could see the weariness in their eyes, a look of long hours and hard cases. Her small hands shook slightly from exhaustion, and though she was surrounded by strangers, a strange calm settled over her. Outside, her parents waited, clinging to each other, nearly drained of hope. For months, they had held on by sheer will, watching their lives collapse with the slow, agonizing certainty that comes from the unknown. Each day Alice was gone had chipped away at them in ways they never imagined possible. Her mother's fingers dug into her father's arm, trying to anchor herself to something real, something solid as they prepared for what might be an impossible moment. The officer opened the door, motioning them in. They walked in slowly, almost hesitantly, as if afraid the room and its contents might vanish if they looked too quickly. And there she was, Alice. Alice, smaller somehow and more fragile, sits quietly with eyes that seemed older, deeper. Alice's mother's voice breaks, soft and uncertain. "Alice?" The little girl looks up, eyes wide. She blinks and then the recognition floods her face. "Mum?" Her voice barely a breath and then louder. "Dad?" Her parents rush forward and in seconds they are all tightly wrapped around each other, a reunion bound by the raw ache of separation. Her mother's hand clutches Alice's head, holding her close as if afraid to ever let go again. Her father's shoulders shake, and though he tries to hold back, silent tears slide down his cheeks. Alice buries her face into her mother's shoulder, her own small hands clutching tightly, trying to feel that this is real, that she is safe, that her parents are here. A movement at the door catches Alice's eye and she turns, still held in her parents' arms. There, just inside the doorway, is Max, thin and scruffy, his fur matted with dirt and his eyes weary. He is unmistakably there. "Max!" she gasps, wriggling free from her parents to run to him. She throws her arms around his neck, burying her face in his rough, familiar fur. Max responds instantly, pressing his nose against her shoulder, nuzzling her with a ferocity that surprises everyone in the room. Her parents exchange stunned glances, watching their daughter embrace the dog they had thought they'd lost forever. Alice's father crouches down, reaching out a hand to touch Max's back, his voice a low murmur. "We thought we'd lost both of you. You came back to us. You brought her back to us." Max responds with a quiet whimper, his body pressed against Alice as if confirming he is finally home. There is a quiet strength in him, a loyalty that no words could capture. Alice lifts her gaze from his fur, noticing something hanging from his mouth, the worn, dirty remains of her favorite doll. Her mother gasps softly, remembering that doll, how Alice had carried it everywhere, its fabric smudged with dirt and love. The doll had gone missing along with Alice and Max, and seeing it now held so gently in Max's mouth brings a new wave of tears. Alice reaches out a trembling hand and takes the doll from Max, who finally allows his grip to relax. She looks at it, the memories flooding back, her fingers trailing over the small tears and loose stitches. Holding the doll brings her a sudden deep comfort, a reminder of the safety and warmth she'd once known. He never let it go. Her voice choked with emotion. He kept it just for me. Her mother wraps her arms around Alice's shoulders, her voice breaking. Yes, sweetheart, Max never gave up on you. He found his way back to us and he brought you with him. For the first time since she'd returned, Alice feels a real smile creep onto her face. She wraps her arms around Max's neck, pressing her cheek into his warm fur. Her father reaches out to stroke Max's head, as if rediscovering a long-lost friend. Thank you, Max. His voice thick. He looks over at his wife and daughter, his heart heavy but full, knowing that this dog had crossed unimaginable distances for his family, defying odds and enduring hardships he couldn't begin to imagine. He holds Alice close, and with her, they hold Max, who had given them back the impossible. At that moment, there are no words needed. The room fills with the unspoken gratitude of a family reunited, bound together by a loyalty that had triumphed over every obstacle. Alice's parents hold her, Max lays beside them, and the four of them, fragile, broken and healing, form a silent vow to never let go again. In the days following the operation, the town buzzes with fragments of the story passed along from one neighbor to the next. People seem to speak of little else. The news had given most details, how police had cracked a trafficking ring, how dozens of children had been rescued, but the community holds tightest to the part of the story not reported in headlines. Max, the dog who had led the way. Down at the station, Detective Clark Graham can hardly finish a cup of coffee without someone stopping by, either to shake his hand or to talk about the dog. That old worn-down German shepherd had, in a way, reignited something in everyone who'd heard the tale, and there was no question that Max deserved it. He's something, isn't he? Officer Mears remarks, leaning against Clark's desk. He glances over to the corner where Max lays, his grey muzzle resting on his paws, looking more tired than heroic. Most dogs would have gone for the food before anything else, but he held on to that doll like his life depended on it. Clark nods, a small smile playing on his lips. The story of Max begins in a place where hope seemed distant. It was at the police station, during the day, that his tale started to unfold. Finished, a faint smile touching his face, he could still recall the sight of Max clutching that grimy doll, his eyes full of urgency. This wasn't just instinct, I'm telling you, Myers. It's like he knew. Myers, it's a rare thing, that kind of loyalty. I mean, the guy looked like he hadn't eaten in days, yet he held on even after he found us. He shook his head. And to think he ended up leading us straight to Alice and the others. For a moment, both men were silent. Clark took another sip of his coffee, eyes lingering on Max. He was well aware that if not for this dog, they'd likely still be looking for Alice and the other kids. In the weeks since the rescue, Max had settled in with Alice and her family. Despite all he'd been through, he had quickly bonded with the girl, following her everywhere, his once tired eyes growing brighter each day. The police station remained Max's second home, though, with him trailing Clark whenever Alice was at school. And he was always met with warmth, the officers offering him treats or scratching his ears as if he were one of their own. One afternoon, as Clark was wrapping up some paperwork, he noticed Mrs. Harper, Alice's mother, waiting in the lobby. He walked over, nodding a polite greeting. Mrs. Harper, voice barely above a whisper. Detective Graham, I wanted to thank you again for everything. It's hard to put into words what you've given us. Clark shook his head, a hint of humility in his eyes. Clark, ma'am, Max did most of the work. He led us there. I think we all just happened to be in the right place. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor, then back to Max, who was resting quietly at Clark's feet. Mrs. Harper, softly. It's funny. I always thought loyalty was a simple thing, but now, Seeing how far he went to find Alice, it's just beyond anything I've ever known." Clark didn't respond immediately. He felt the same, though he wouldn't say it aloud. There was a depth to this dog's loyalty, a persistence he couldn't quite understand. Max hadn't simply shown devotion, he displayed a commitment that went beyond survival, beyond reason. Mrs. Harper. Alice, she sleeps with him at her side every night now, and she's so much more herself. Not that she's forgotten what happened, none of us ever will. But having him there gives her peace. She smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Max has given her back something that I thought was lost. Clark watched as Mrs. Harper knelt to pet Max, her hand moving gently over his head. Max didn't move but let out a soft, contented sigh, his eyes closing. He seemed to understand, in that uncanny way animals sometimes did, that he was needed. Clark, quietly, serious yet gentle, "Just remember, he'll always have a place here too. Anytime, he's one of us." As Mrs. Harper and Max prepared to leave, Clark found himself watching them longer than he expected. For all the darkness he'd seen in this case, Max's presence was a reminder of something pure, a loyalty that transcended words or gestures. That dog had led them into the heart of a nightmare, but in doing so, he'd also brought a glimmer of hope to the children they'd saved, to their family, and to a community that was forever changed. That night, as Clark drove home, he couldn't shake the weight of what Mrs. Harper had said. Max's loyalty, his dedication, went beyond anything anyone could ask of a person, let alone an animal. And the ripple effects were everywhere, from the families who slept easier to the officers who felt a renewed sense of purpose each time they saw Max walk through the station door. It was as if the dog had become a silent ambassador of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, love and loyalty could prevail. The following morning, Clark was greeted by Max waiting outside the station as usual. As Clark stepped out of his car, Max trotted over, his tail wagging softly. Clark knelt down, giving the dog a gentle pat. "Clark, good to see you again, partner." Max looked up, his eyes calm, as if he too knew his work here wasn't over yet. In the weeks and months that followed, the town continued to spread the story of the dog who had defied all odds. Max had become more than just a companion. He was a symbol for the townspeople. He was proof that loyalty could inspire bravery, and that kindness, even in its simplest forms, had the power to lift others from the depths. For Clark, every time he glanced down at Max by his side, he was reminded of one unshakable truth. Even in the darkness, there would always be those who held fast, those who searched until they found light. And sometimes, they came in the form of an old, weary dog with nothing but a worn-out doll in his mouth and a heart full of unspoken promises. Max's story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can make the biggest difference, not only for those we love, but for entire communities. If you've ever had an experience where a pet, a friend, or even a stranger showed you unexpected loyalty or courage, we'd love to hear about it. Share your story with us in the comments below, because these moments of bravery and kindness deserve to be told. Let's keep the conversation going, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story touched your heart. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and stay tuned for more inspiring stories like Max's. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and remember, hope and loyalty are always closer than we think.